Welcome to this session, Transformation of the Geopolitical and Economic Order in the Middle East. The regional order of the region, never Pacific at the best of times, is being dramatically reshaped by the bloody conflict in Syria and its dramatic spillover into Iraq, political contests in Egypt and Turkey, and the patchy transformations in the Maghreb, the strategic activism and ambitions of the Gulf states, and the unconditional but uncertain progress in talks over Iran's nuclear program. The seizure of Mosul by ISIS in June sent a shockwave through the region and prompted a reappraisal of the policies of the regional and extra-regional powers. There are many questions that now attend the multilateral coalition that aims to degrade and destroy ISIS, including whether the coalition will hold, whether ground forces will have to be introduced, and what this means for relations with the Assad government. Our strategic survey, launched earlier this week, included the insight that actually ISIS's prime base of operations and stronghold is in Syria rather than Iraq. Looming over everything, of course, is a broader question: to what extent are the regional states, as currently constituted, viable? Our speakers today are Dr. Barham Salih, who was in mid-2004, as the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq wound up, was appointed Deputy Prime Minister in Ayad Alawi's interim government. He served again as Deputy Prime Minister of Iraq for more than 3 years in the country's first ever elected government under Nouri al-Maliki, where he was a state builder and on the prime forces for technocratic reform. Thereafter, in autumn 2012, his party list won a majority in the Kurdistan regional legislative elections, and he thereafter became Prime Minister, serving for 3 years and conducting the landmark contract with ExxonMobil. Our second speaker, Roula Khalaf, is the foreign editor and assistant editor of the Financial Times. In a career that nearly spans 20 years, I can offer her congratulations on that, slightly ahead of time. She's been North Africa correspondent, Middle East correspondent, and now Middle East editor. She writes regularly on Middle East business and politics, and she's a regular attender at the Manama Dialogue. I recall several probing questions she has made from the floor, but today the tables are turned, Roula. Finally, we have Professor Toby Dodge, IISS Senior Consulting Fellow for the Middle East and Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is the author of 3 books on Iraq, most recently Iraq From War to a New Authoritarianism, which The Economist named last year as one of its books of the year and called it a tale worthy of Shakespeare. We will hold back the Bard of Aldwych until the final speaker on this session. I will discriminate positively in favour of the only panellist who has been educated in Liverpool, and I'll ask Dr. Barham Salih, please, to begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's wonderful to be here and meeting so many friends. The title of this session, The Transformation of Geopolitical and Geo-Economic Order in the Middle East. At least in my lifetime, the Middle East has always been in transformation. Yet, when you look at the fundamentals of my part of the world, there are certain permanent features that do not change and that do not get transformed. Talking of geopolitics, the 3 major power centers of the Middle East, Anatolia, Persia, and the Arab worlds, continue to be at it, and they collide, they compete, and often in Mesopotamia, where these struggles take different manifestations from one era to another. But I do believe this remains a basic feature of politics and events in the Middle East. 20th century, the Europeans arrived. General Maud, the British commander at the time, arrived in Baghdad, hailed the British intervention as the liberation, not occupation. And in the 21st century, the Americans arrived in Iraq too as well, more or less using the same language. When you look at parallels between those 2 eras, you can see, despite the many changes on the surface, fundamentals remain the same. What is fascinating in these times, the nation-state structures that the Europeans built in the Middle East, the Sykes-Picot arrangement, is being challenged in a fundamental way, not by Kurdish nationalists, not by even Arab nationalists who espoused Arab unity, but by fundamentalist Islamists, ISIS in their latest incarnation, that have gone through the Iraq-Syria border claiming or announcing the end of the Sykes-Picot arrangement. From my vantage point, I do not necessarily see changes of borders, but I do see a fundamental challenge to the nation-state structures that have dominated Middle Eastern economic, political, and security order throughout the 20th century. And this challenge emanates primarily from a crisis of legitimacy of governing elites that has led to crisis after crisis. I was reading today an insightful piece by a friend whom many of you would know, Hisham Melhem in Politico magazine, talking about ISIL, speaking of it as a tumor being produced by the alien Arab political culture or Islamic political culture. We have a very serious issue, no doubt, talking about ISIL. It's a major problem for Iraq, is a major problem for Syria, is a major problem for the Middle East, and it is of great consequence to international security and international order. In a nutshell, from my vantage point, ISIL has demonstrated that mission was not accomplished in Iraq. Mission is yet to be accomplished in my part of the world. Iraq is truly being on the brink of a very serious crisis, sectarian strife, political instability have been plaguing this country for some time. History does not start in Iraq since 2003. It predates that by a long, long time, but certainly the problems of the country as we have tried to put together a new political system has been exacerbated by a number of factors, including regional interventions, including missteps by the international-led coalition, by the US-led coalition at the time. But I would have to say also by many, many problems that Iraqi political elite have, mistakes that they have committed since 2003 to date. I do not want to personalize issues. Many have said that it has been the fault of Mr. Maliki's led government, in which I served as the chairman has alluded. No doubt there were many, many terrible mistakes that that government has committed and has led to exacerbation of sectarian and ethnic strife in the country. Has been many missed opportunities and many missteps that have aggravated the situation and ultimately has helped the ISIL insurgency, ISIL terrorism evolve and provided it with that enabling environment. Needless to say, these have been the case, yes, but we also need to understand that beyond the issue of persons, there are fundamental structural problems in Iraq that needs to be addressed. One of which has to be an inclusive government that can bring in the various communities of Iraq, Sunnis, Kurds, and Shias, to make sure that this country will have a chance at surviving the many challenges it is facing. We have a new government in Iraq led by Mr. Abadi. We all need to support that government to make sure that it can succeed, but that government also needs to make sure that it will have a genuinely different political orientation from the past, to making sure that the various communities of Iraq are truly represented. Otherwise, this security and political instability of the country will not be resolved. Iraqi political elite from the various communities really need to come together to face up to that threat. This is not a Shia problem alone. This is not a Sunni problem alone. This is not a Kurdish problem alone. We need to come together because this threat is one that is facing all the communities of Iraq and all the political parties, main political parties of the country. We must make sure that ISIL will not win, and that requires leadership. And I very much hope that the new government in Iraq will be offered the political support inside the country that can enable it to take on this challenge. But we also have to understand that this is not a domestic Iraqi issue. It's a regional issue, and I dare say is also a global issue. The implication of the war in Syria has been quite profound for Iraq. We have warned about that for some time. The ongoing carnage in Syria has been truly painful to Muslims, to humans across the world. And undeniably, the continuing violence in Syria will have ramifications to regional and global security, and countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, I dare say Saudi Arabia, Turkey, will all be affected by this scourge. We have to understand, we have to acknowledge that this is of consequence to the whole region. We have to understand and also acknowledge that this is of global consequence. Therefore, this is not something that the region on its own can deal with it. The region, the communities in that part of the world need to be empowered in order to take on this scourge, but they need help from the international community and from the neighboring countries. We are pleased to have this international coalition being built, but I have to also be honest with myself, and as it has been said, this is not the alliance of the willing, this is the alliance of the unwilling, this has been the alliance of the hesitants. Many diverse interests are involved in this thing, and the jury is still out whether this coalition can stand the test of time and whether the various parties can really put their energy and their resources and their commitment to eradicating the scourge of extremism in our part of the world. One hope for me is that the world can learn from the past. We just were listening to the previous session on Russia and the Ukraine, and there were some important historical analysis. Going back to my earlier statement that mission was not accomplished in Iraq and in that part of the world, this reminds me of Afghanistan all over again. During the war in Afghanistan after the Soviet occupation, almost the same parties that are involved in this present-day conflict in Syria and, for that matter, in Iraq, were involved as a way of defeating the Soviet Union and its proxies. Money, resources went to the Afghan Mujahideens, and attention was not paid to some important details in the process. And extremists like Al-Qaeda and others were empowered, were allowed. Once the Soviet Union was defeated, it was declared that mission was accomplished. Everybody went back and thought that Al-Qaeda and these extremists were marginalized. They were confined to the caves of Afghanistan and not to be worried about, only to discover on September 11 that things were not quite like that. I remember echoes of that analogy, that analysis in Iraq, when mission was accomplished, when we did not have to worry about Iraq and Syria for that matter. And exactly the same themes are going in. The same countries that have funded Afghani Mujahideens have been players in this conflict in Syria. At this time, perhaps, in order to defeat Assad and the Iranians. But in the process, terrible extremism have been empowered, allowing that environment to incubate these extremist ideologies. Now we do have a problem. My hope is that we are learning from history, that despite these various differences between the Saudis, the Turks, the Iranians, between the Russians and the Americans, between Iraqis, between Shias, Sunnis and Kurds, we all need to wake up to that reality. This menace is threatening all of us. There were some Kurds who might have thought this is not our problem, only to discover that ISIS were coming to us. There were some Americans that were thinking that this is not our problem, these are ancient problems that the West does not have to worry about. Norwegians, I'm told, have to be concerned because many have joined with ISIL. Americans have joined with ISIL. Brits have gone with ISIL. This is a problem for the world to deal with. But having said that, I will also have to say, ultimately, this is a problem that can only be resolved in a fundamental way by the people of the region, by the Muslims of that part of the world, because it cannot be done by the Americans for us. It cannot be done by the Europeans for us. It will have to be done by Muslims, by Arabs, by Kurds, by indigenous communities of that part of the world who are being traumatized by this menace. But we need the help of the international community. You cannot be indifferent to this dynamic. And I very much hope also, as we do that, the West, the Americans, the Europeans also understand this is not about surgical strikes. It's not just about a military solution, because you can defeat this particular formation of ISIL, you can defeat Al-Qaeda here and there, but you will end up with ISIL. ISIL could be defeated, but you'll end up also with the son of ISIL, with the cousin of ISIL, and this cycle of instability will continue. I would say, again, the lesson from Afghanistan, and for that matter, the lesson from Iraq, is not just about being seen to doing the right thing and providing the military hardware and the military help, but it is also about insisting on political reforms and insisting on legitimacy issues that will deny these extremists the type of incubating environment that they are in. There was an interesting article in Reuters a couple of days ago about the type of money being made out of this conflict, about the oil smuggling that ISIL is doing. I would ask you, and I would ask IISS also, to really look into a level beyond that, what I call the political economy of these conflicts. There is a lot of money being made out of this conflict. It's not only by ISIL that money is being made, but also by so-called security establishment, the mafia-style governing elites here and there who are really creating this symbiosis between the extremists and the establishments there, and sustaining this conflict. This conflict is sustained for a variety of reasons, but part of which is money, part of which is that political economy that keeps it going. I really think that if we do not want 10 years from now to still be talking about the successor to ISIL and what the West should do, we really need to look at fundamentals that have given rise time and again to these type of extremism in our part of the world. I acknowledge, coming from there and being involved with politics, fundamentally this is our problem. We need to deal with it. We need to take responsibility for it. But we also need to understand that the international community needs to empower that region. They needs to empower the people of that part of the world to really stand up to this menace and not to allow it to continue the way it has been. No easy solutions, long-term, generational issue, requires the neighborhood to come together. Whether we like it or not, there can be no solution without the neighborhood, the Saudis, the Iranians, the Turks, the Americans for that matter, and the Russians to come in together. And I think given the gravity of the situation that we're dealing with this problem in terms of the security implications of extremist Islamist terrorism, is a concern for the Americans. I do believe it's a concern for the Russians, given the Muslim republics and some of the consequences that they had to deal with. Whether we like it or not, this will take a much more fundamental approach in terms of bringing these various disparate elements and players together on that very common theme, namely defeating and taking on this extreme manifestation of terrorism that we have witnessed. But I go back and I want to conclude with this thing. This can only be done by really addressing the fundamental causes of this disease that is afflicting our societies, that lies in the sole issue of legitimacy and good governance. Thank you.
Dr. Salih, thank you very much. Turn now to Roula Khalaf, please.
Thank you. It is an unusual place for me to be sitting at an IISS conference. What I'm good at is telling stories. And I'd like to start with a story. Just over 3 years ago, on the night that Hosni Mubarak fell, I was in Tahrir Square. I walked with my colleagues for hours. We took selfies with the soldiers on the tanks. We were kissing the kids as they were jumping onto the tanks. We were listening to Kulthum. I don't know if you know the song Ana Shab, Ana Shab. It was a euphoric moment that today and over the past year, when I look back at it, sometimes I have to wonder whether I dreamt it. And if it weren't for a picture that I have on my wall of the day after the fall of Hosni Mubarak, when in a sudden bout of civic responsibility, people were sweeping the floors themselves. They brought their brooms from their houses and they were sweeping all over Tahrir Square and way beyond the square. And that's the picture that I have in my living room. It feels to me today that we've really come full circle. We are where we were in the post 9/11 years. We're dealing with the threat of jihadi violence. We're dealing with economic stagnation, economic regression, and we're dealing still with the same desperation that the young people of the Middle East have had for decades. I want to make 3 observations today. The first is that we are today in a comprehensive mess. I can't remember, I've been covering this region for the better part of 20 years, and I can't remember another time where the very existence of states is being questioned. I cannot tell you if Iraq is going to be Iraq in about 5 years. I don't know if Syria will exist as a state. And frankly, I don't know if my own country, where I come from, Lebanon, will be a united state. In Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, and to some extent also in Yemen, we have failed states with different degrees of bloodshed. Lebanon and Jordan, we have a risk of contagion. Egypt is more stable, but only on the surface. What I mean by stable is that it's not as chaotic as we've seen the last 3 years. But I think that it faces a political crisis that is far more acute than anything we had during the Hosni Mubarak years. Tunisia, Morocco, and the Gulf do seem to be exceptions. But the Gulf today is more autocratic and more hardline than in the past. And to me, that's a geopolitical risk rather than a sign of geopolitical stability. My second point is that there are emerging fault lines in the region today that make any attempt to resolve these crises a lot more difficult. One of the most damaging cleavages in the Middle East is the Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which plays out through proxy wars in more than one battlefield. Western negotiations with Iran widened this cleavage. Perhaps Iraq is slightly narrowing it because both the US and Iran have a common interest in stabilizing Iraq. But I'm not convinced that the various stories that have been circulating about a détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia actually reflect the reality. I think that the progress of the nuclear negotiations and whether they end up in failure or success, it's not clear yet what that will mean for the Arab Gulf monarchies. As I'm sure you all know, this proxy war plays out actively in Syria, in Lebanon, and more recently in Yemen, and of course, as Mr. Salih just mentioned, in Iraq. And it plays out in a very sectarian way. It adds an element of religious hatred that makes any attempt to deal with it on a purely political level a lot more difficult. A lot of emotions come into play. People get ahead of themselves. Common sense no longer prevails in these cases. The second cleavage is, and that's a more recent divide, but I think is also very damaging, is between the pro and anti-Islamist camps. And that's one of the most significant geopolitical ramifications of what we've come to call the Arab Spring. You now have a set of countries, Egypt, United Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, which have worked very hard to counter the rise of political Islam following the Arab uprisings. And they have succeeded in neutralizing this trend. On the other side stand Qatar and Turkey, who had been champions in the Islamist parties, and frankly are not able today to come to terms with the fact that they have lost. My third point, and I think this is important, and because there are so many political crises today in the Middle East, we tend to overlook it. And what I notice is that we also have today a crisis of institutions, which is unprecedented. Institutions that you could once call pillars of the state, institutions that were the only remaining pillars in some cases. I'm talking here, for example, of the judiciary in Egypt. That was the only institution that you could still say was independent. Today, it is completely corrupted and completely co-opted by the political system. I'm also talking about education, which no one is focusing on anymore, about healthcare systems that are deteriorating. I was in Lebanon over the summer, and it's true that the state in Lebanon has never been strong. Nobody's really relied on the state. But what bothers people most of all today is not Hezbollah or Daesh or the latest bomb scare. It's more the fact that nobody can trust the health system anymore. It's true also that in the GCC, government expenditure on education is comparable to many developed countries, but the returns are far lower. Does it surprise anyone that in this context we have a virus like ISIS? We call it ISIS at the Financial Times, and I know everybody's confused, but I'll stick to that. I don't think that we should be surprised at all. I think ISIS is the result of multiple failures, of both governments, failures of societies, failures of Western attempts to shape this region into its own image. It's a complete mess that manifests itself in an extreme way through jihadi violence. I was asked to focus a little bit on Syria because we're going to hear a lot about Iraq this morning. And I think that if ISIS is the virus, then Syria is in fact its biggest victim. For the past 3.5 years, people have been killed in Syria on a daily basis through every imaginable method of repression, from chemical attacks to barrel bombs to bombing whole neighborhoods. And if you think today that the fight against ISIS in Iraq is going to be a struggle, then believe me, I think Syria is going to be a mission impossible. Although I understood that airstrikes early on in this conflict could have made a difference, it could have tipped the balance against the Assad regime, and it may have strengthened the rebels at a time when the rebel force was still one that I think the West could have accepted and dealt with. I think that today we're just very late in the game, and I have serious doubts that even if you were to degrade ISIS in Syria and in Iraq, that you're going to end up with a less violent and more stable Syria. In Iraq, the US has several cards in its favor in the fight against ISIS. It has a political class that essentially looked into the abyss and decided to try and take a step back. It has a government that asked for the intervention, and it has regional allies, including Iran. I shouldn't say allies, it has regional states, including Iran, that have a stake in stabilizing Iraq. In Syria, there are a host of factors that restrain the US's ability to effect change and the likelihood of success. For starters, the US has to find a legal argument. Unlike Iraq, it is not being asked to intervene by the government. In fact, the government that is in place in Syria is one that the US is, that official US policy is to try to get rid of. I think the US will end up arguing that Iraq has asked for this campaign against ISIS and that this requires cross-border operations. But while the US doesn't expect this to be a major issue, I suspect that it will be controversial. Second, in Syria, the Iran-backed Shia militias, whether they are Iraqi or Lebanese, and both of them exist, they're fighting a broader war to prop up the Assad regime. Their enemies are ISIS, but their enemies are also the other rebels that the US is going to be backing. Third, I think that there's a very tricky balancing act, which I'm not sure can be achieved. That is to fight ISIS without bolstering the Assad regime. How do you guarantee, for example, that if ISIS is driven out of a strategic spot, the vacuum won't be filled by government forces? Fourth, and that's where I think it gets even more complicated, the US has to train a force to take on ISIS. That's going to take time. That's why we hear more and more of Syria as a longer-term campaign, as if it's a distant second stage. This force is supposed to be about 5,000 troops, and obviously that's not sufficient. General Dempsey said earlier this week that the goal is to train this force within a year. It's also not clear who this force can work with on the ground. Some of the largest and the most militarily effective groups are not very far from ISIS in their ideology. In fact, they are allies of Al-Qaeda. I'm referring here to groups like Nusra Front and Ahrar al-Sham. As the new force is being trained, and indeed long after, these groups, which are acceptable and indeed in some cases backed by some Arab states, will continue to operate. My personal concern is that a three-way war will become a 4-, 5-, 6-way war with an even greater disintegration in Syria. Perhaps ISIS will be weakened, but it's unlikely that it can be eliminated in such an environment. There's also a question of the loyalty of any rebel force that the US will be forming. The US will want it to report to some local group and not to be seen as an American proxy. Knowing the Middle East, I can guarantee you that it will be seen as an American proxy. So in terms of timing, of the complexities of the effort, of the dynamics on the ground, and the fact that the US will remain very cautious and will not be drawn more substantially into a war in Syria, I think more than ever, what we at the FT have called the Afghanistan on the Middle East will continue to be. And on this depressing note, I'm going to end. Thank you, Nick.
Roula, thank you. Fortunately, we have Toby Dodge to raise our spirits.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in Oslo this morning, especially on the platform with two old friends. I'm not in any way going to disagree, but possibly amplify, and there's what's been already said. There's a good reason for this. A lot of my lessons in Iraqi politics were taught to me in the haven and the hospitality of Dr. Barham's front garden at the height of the Iraqi civil war. So therefore, I will echo what he and what Roula have said. And I try to think about the big strategic themes and issues that have dominated the Middle East over the last 10 years and will set to accelerate going forward. So clearly this would be after regime change in 2003, after the Arab Spring in 2011, and after the seizure of Mosul by the Islamic State or ISIL in June 2014. Now, what I want to argue today against this background, that the primary strategic issue is not Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi the Islamic State and the tragic beheadings of Western journalists and aid workers. I would argue this is a symptom, and it's the last decade has produced a number of either very weak states, failing states, or indeed failed states across the region that have acted as an incubator for these trans-state radical forces. We have Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. Now, this doesn't prove, one, that all states in the region are destined to fail because of their colonial imposition in the aftermath of the First World War. If we take Dr. Barham's argument that it's the agency of Muslims, be they Iranians or Arabs across the region, then that agency has taken those states since 1920 and, for better or worse, transformed them and indigenized them. And secondly, these states aren't going to be replaced by ethnically or religiously more coherent stateless based on somehow more authentic identities. I think instead the Middle East faces a series of problems that are not, I'll be bold here, primarily religious and are certainly not unique to the region. They're global, and here's the big point, centrally political. Now, the first big problem, I think, is the use, as Roula's alluded to, the use of populist, inflammatory, and increasingly sectarian rhetoric by politicians to bolster their own core constituencies, but in a kind of foreign policy power projection, seeking to undermine minority constituencies in other people's states. Secondly, again, as Roula has said, we have the collapse of institutions across the states of the Middle East, which have been undermined by corruption and incompetence, and rejected largely because of this by populations seeing them as predatory, not service institutions that deliver a better hope. And this has left the ruling regimes of the region to rely on coercion and then the false promise of rhetoric that's long been rejected by an alienated population. So against this background, a sustainable campaign in Iraq, in Syria, against ISIL will not primarily be militarily across the long term. It will be political. It will be driving the reform of civil state institutions, which reach back into society and tie the population back to the state. Now, I'll justify that by looking for a minute or two at the rise of the Islamic State. Now, let's cast our mind back to February 2007, when George W. Bush launched the surge, imposed counterinsurgency doctrine on Iraq riven by civil war. Now, that unfolded militarily in what can, I think, be comfortably justified as a success. Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia, and then afterwards the Islamic State was decimated militarily. Its numbers went down by, say, 2009 to the low hundreds. When al-Baghdadi took control of the Islamic State in 2010, its recruits were very small, but they were clearly battle-hardened. The survival of the most competent in the face of that successful military campaign. They had very good operational security, and they were very well organized. We could almost call them jihadis with MBAs. They collected metrics of their own attacks, they wrote annual reports, and they engaged in a ghoulish, detailed accounting about how much money it cost to kill the people that they were targeting. Now, Baghdadi took this organization and in July 2012 announced the Breaking Down the Walls campaign, which overtly set out to retake the territory and dominate the population that they'd been driven out of during the surge. By October 2012, the best estimates of the US and Iraqi governments indicated that the Islamic State had already doubled the number of fighters in its ranks over the last 12 months, up to nearly 2,500. July 2013 sees the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant launch another campaign, Soldiers' Harvest. This builds up to the seizure of Ramadi and Fallujah in December, January 2014. Now, the point of this, the tracking of the rejuvenation of the Islamic State, is not to identify an unbeatable, efficient political terrorist organization, but to identify the background that fed the growth of this phenomenon. In 2013, best estimates would put the ISIL's forces at about 3,000. In June 2014, at the height of the rebellion when Mosul was seized, what numbers are we talking about? Maybe 3,000 hardcore fighters with another 5,000 new recruits. We may be up to as many as 20,000, but the point is the revolt that swept over, that seized Mosul and swept over northwest Iraq, out of Nineveh province towards Baghdad, into Diyala, up to the Jabal Sinjar, and then targeted Erbil, was not only the work of this terrorist organization, it capitalized on the alienation of a section of Iraqi society who felt themselves at best to have been ignored by the government in Baghdad, and at worst to be persecuted and peripherized by it. So the Islamic State clearly is a terrorist organization, albeit a very effective one, but it is fed off the political, economic, and then finally coercive failings of the government in Baghdad. And what we saw after June 2014 was a myriad, as many as 5 different groups rising up to push the Iraqi state out of the territories that were then quickly dominated by this radical, violent, oppressive force of the Islamic State. Now, to understand that in my last 4 minutes, we need to turn to politics. And we could start at any date from 2003 and the creation of the Iraqi system that's given rise to this failure. But I would start in the aftermath of the elections of 2010, because it's then you had a very high turnout, and a very high turnout especially across the Sunni majority areas that are now dominated by the Islamic State. And that's because those sections of the wider Iraqi population invested in 2010 in the ballot box, turned their back on insurgency and rebellion, and that saw Iraq here take 91 seats in parliament to the 89 seats of state of law. But of course, that moment of optimism, probably the last moment of optimism that we could share on Iraq, that outpouring of hope of the Iraqi population into the electoral process, was in the end frittered away. In December 2011, Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi was driven from power, and much, much more worryingly, in December 2012, the popular native of Anbar, the Minister of Finance, Rafi al-Assawi's house was raided. His bodyguards, like Hashimi's, were arrested, and then he was finally driven from the cabinet in March 2003. It's this targeting of popular, democratically elected politicians who've been brought into cabinet that triggered spontaneous demonstrations across the Sunni-dominated areas of the northwest, which were, in the end, put down by military force of the departed, wielded by the departed Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki. So it is political failure, economic failure, institutional failure, and the rampant corruption that backgrounds the rise of the Islamic State. Now, we can look at a moment of enthusiasm, a moment of optimism. Nouri al-Maliki is removed, Haider al-Abadi comes into power with a great deal of goodwill, both locally, regionally, and internationally. I think Abadi himself is making all the right noises. He's modest, conciliatory, and I think the wonderful thing that he's pinpointed in his first speech after the cabinet was appointed was the decentralizing of Iraqi state power down to the provincial level, making local politicians in the provinces responsible for how money is spent, and therefore elected and, more importantly, kicked out of office because of that. If we look at the provincial elections, especially in 2009 and the last provincial elections, we see a very high turnover of provincial politicians. That the election campaigns are untainted largely by sectarian rhetoric, where those voting in provincial elections say, where is my electricity? Where are the bread and butter issues that I elected the provincial governors to deal with? They haven't dealt with them. Get them out of here. And so therefore, if the Prime Minister stays true to his word, decentralizes power, puts financial and policy representation at the provincial level, that voting policy, as democracy is meant to work, of holding politicians responsible for the decline in the Iraqi voters' everyday lives, may well be the way forward. That said, that's a hell of a political engineering, hopefully driven forward by an Iraqi prime minister with a lot of optimism. What worries me and that this is closely reading the speech, Obama's speech, where he launches his new Iraq policy. As in parenthesis, it's ironic that the last few years of Obama's administration will be dominated, as was George W. Bush's, by stabilizing Iraq once more. But I think there's an awful lot invested in the Iraqi cabinet that took power on the 8th of September, and it contains a great deal of old faces, of old political dynamics, the recognition of sectarian quotas, which directly fed the rampant industrial-scale corruption that's undermined the state and led to the rise of ISIL and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So my final thoughts are that if Iraqis are to be allowed to rebuild the Iraqi state, state building from the ground up, from the provincial level upwards, they'll need a huge amount of regional and international support. But that starts way beyond the military campaign that's now getting underway, the air power that's now getting underway to contain and roll back the Islamic State. What needs to be rebuilt is the civil institutions of the Iraqi state that give the Iraqi population something to look back to Baghdad to and say, oh yes, we'll fight for this state because it's not as corrupt as its predecessors, that it's delivering services, and it's spending our oil money in a way that we can directly experience and appreciate. Thank you.
Toby, thank you. We have, I'll aim to end this session at 12 o'clock, so I propose to take questions for the next 10 minutes and then give our panelists 4 minutes each. Premium, please, on brevity. And the first person to have caught my eye was Dr. Mahmoud, please.
Briefly, I'm Navana Mahmoud, British Egyptian. And to Roula Khalaf, I would like to reassure you, Tahrir didn't die. We're just dealing with the political sewage that was hidden underneath Tahrir. But the youth who are going on hunger strike now are still alive and still active. A brief question to Dr. Salih. Is independent Kurdistan will ever happen, or it will be like Scotland, a dream that will never materialize? And please, I don't want a politically correct answer. Thank you.
Yes, you please, sir. Could you state your name, please?
Thank you. Wuld Abdallah, from Mauritania, from Special Representative of the UN. First, I'm very happy to hear Roula. I have read her. It has been always a pleasure. To hear her is so refreshing. And she pointed out the real problem that exists, in my opinion, in the region. The failure, the bankruptcy of the institution, education, health, justice. It is the same in my own region, in the Maghreb and the Sahel. We will not address stability in the region as long as the issues she mentioned are forgotten. Now, on Mr. Salih, I have a question. You mentioned something, everyone will agree with you, that 20th century UK was in Iraq, 21st century US in Iraq. That is true. But 20th century, even 19th century, UK was in China. Other people were in Indonesia, in Iraq. How do you explain that the result today is not the same? Why Indonesia is a success, Malaysia, Korea, and in our region, we always blame the others. I would like to understand this continued failure and refusal to accept it, blaming the other. Now, final point.
Sorry, can we stop there, please?
Final point is...
No, sorry, we have to move. Sorry, we have to move on to other questions now. We have to move on to other questions now, please, sir. Qasim Salameh, please.
I have two quick questions. The first is Professor Dodge. You mentioned that Abadi is trying to sort of provincialize or decentralize resources. But you didn't mention, I think, the most important part of his program, that is decentralizing security by the creation of a National Guard on a provincial sectarian basis. What is your view of the future of this part of his program? And another question, the moderator has started by saying that the future of ISIL, if it has a future, is more in Syria than in Iraq. Well, I do believe that there are reasons not to rush to this conclusion. I think the Iraqi obstacle is very far from being overcome. The hardcore of the group is basically Iraqi. It is in Iraq that the international attention to ISIL has been brought, although it has been active for 2 years in Syria, but nobody took notice. It is when Mosul fell that. So I think the Iraqi obstacle is far from being behind us, so we start looking into its future in Syria. And I would like the panelists to sort of comment on their optimism versus skepticism about the easiness of finishing it off in Iraq.
Thank you. Dr. Al-Khattabi, please.
Thank you. I'm Sam Al-Khattabi from UAE. Just have a comment, first of all, just not to go into that the terrorism is only Sunni. We have all kinds of terrorism. There is Shiite terrorism, there is Christian terrorism, so it's not a Sunni phenomenon. The other thing that after Daeshism, is there any security plan how to counter those people, taking in consideration this is not an army? So after that, those people that are going to spill over Saudi, Jordan, all these countries, I think there is no focus on that, taking in consideration also that Obama said this is a 3 years, Saud al-Faisal said it is a 10 years war. So after Daeshism, what will be the geopolitical, the new geopolitical in the region? Thank you.
Thank you. There's a gentleman at the back. He was holding up his name board. I can't read your name, but please put your question, sir.
Thank you. Hisham Hellier from Brookings and Russi. I'm glad that the point was raised about the underlying issues within the region, particularly with regards to youth. Egypt, for example, is a country where the majority of the population are under the age of 25. I thought that something might have happened with regards to those fissures sometime over the last 3 years. It hasn't yet, and I think that would be very silly to assume that it's not likely at some point in the near future. My question relates to Libya. Because it's a country that hasn't really taken much attention over the last hour. Libya stands in a very difficult position, I believe, at present, and stands on the precipice of being a combination of Syria and Somalia. I think that's extremely possible. And I'd be interested in hearing the panelists' views on the problems that are rising at present within Libya and the impacts of that, not only on neighboring countries such as Tunisia and Egypt, which are already quite clear, if not talked about that much, but within the region and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. Wali-ur-Rahman, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not from an Arab country, and that's why perhaps I thought I should say a few words. 2 questions, simple questions. First, I'll take on Roula. You have talked about Islamic Brotherhood and the new dispensation in Egypt. Sitting in Bangladesh, far away Asian Muslim majority country, for us, Islamic Brotherhood was a greater danger because they were supplying money and support to our Islamists in Bangladesh. But at least the military government is sparing us from that point. So your answer to that, ma'am. My second question is to Mr. Salih. So you have mentioned about the ISIL taking oil and making money and then supplies with that they are fighting. And the oil is being bought or helped to buy or to be sold by the elites in Iraq. But you have not mentioned some other people. Who are they? Would you please mention? We would be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Final question in this session, and I know she will keep it to the requisite 90 seconds and not a second longer. Oksana Antonienko, please.
Thank you very much. I have Actually, two questions to Mr. Salih about the political economy behind ISIS. What would you recommend for the international community to do to change the political economic considerations? And for Roula, can you say a few words about the sort of efforts to enhance resilience of neighboring states, Lebanon and Jordan, but Turkey also to some extent, to withstand protracted conflict in Syria?
We'll go in the order that speakers spoke. So Barham Salih first, please.
I will respond directly to my Egyptian friend about whether Kurdish independence will happen or will we be like Scotland. Definitely we're not in Scotland, we're not in the British Isles, we are in the heart of the Middle East, surrounded by neighbors whom you know. It's a tough neighborhood. Every Kurd wants independence. The Kurdish people are the largest community in the world that have not achieved independence, so it's quite natural. Every Kurd yearns for independence. No Kurd, no Kurdish group, no Kurdish leader has renounced that legitimate right. But I genuinely believe it depends on Baghdad, on Iraqi politics. If Iraq were to become a success, Kurds would be willing to live in Iraq, and this has been the history of the last 10 years. Kurds have pursued their national agenda and national priorities is absolutely right. But if you look at things in context, to be fair, Kurds were probably the most responsible of players, more committed to Iraqi unity than Shia or Sunni sectarian politics. So I genuinely believe that Iraq's future lies in the hands of the Baghdad politics. The Kurds retain that dream, that hope. But if Iraq were to move in a positive direction, become stable, becomes prosperous, I would not want to dream too big and say democratic, but quasi-democratic, quasi-decent, and so on, the chances are the Kurds will remain part of Iraq. But if Iraq were to degenerate, then the country will implode. But ironically also, and this is probably the mother of all ironies, it is not Kurdish nationalists who are challenging the borders of the Middle East. It is so-called Islamist extremists that are driving through the border posts and saying this is the end of Sykes-Picot. To me, borders have been a very painful, as a Kurd, has been a very painful feature of the Middle East and so on. But in reality, if you go to the basics, it is about the character of states, the character of governance. So one of the issues that is before the Abadi government today, Iraq cannot be ruled with a centralized system and a centralized machinery. You cannot have a Whitehall running the Iraqi state from Baghdad. That has proven to be a failure time and again. And partly it is also because of the political economy. You have easy money in a country like Iraq emanating from oil, especially with this high oil prices, and lack of accountability and strong institutions is bound to create bad government. It's bound to create, it's bound to corrupt leaders of the country. Therefore, one safeguard for Iraq is to go decentralized. The example of Iraqi Kurdistan is a good way to go forward. Iraqi Kurdistan has been the most stable part of Iraq, has been the most prosperous part of Iraq, and today in the war against ISIL is probably the most reliable partner the international community and the neighborhood has, and yet it has remained part of the Iraqi state and it can be helpful. Therefore, I think that that model could be emulated, obviously with important variations here and there. I go back to one important question, why other countries in terms of history were a success and not countries like Iraq and so on. And I'm a believer in history in a way. Again, going back to that analogy with the British and the Americans, and if you read the proceeds of the debates in British House of Commons in the 1920s, and you read the transcripts of debates in the US Congress after the Iraq 2003 intervention, you find a lot of similar echoes in that way. I think it's probably because we're talking about the Middle East where religion matters, where forces of history continue to be at play, and it's very difficult to move away from that. I would add to it, being in Norway, also the resource curse. easy money. I mean, I have been in government for a long time, for a while, and, you know, governments do not have to work hard at policies and efficient policies. Money comes from oil. You don't have to work hard for it. You have problems, you throw money at it. Lack of strong institutions and accountability ends up into the cycle. So you end up with Saddam and the successors to Saddam and that type of political culture. And I was talking to Ayman al-Safadi, a Jordanian friend. Jordan has no oil, and probably its government has to work a lot harder to justify expenditure, and therefore you're less prone to making the kind of mistakes that we do in a country like Iraq. But also there is another factor, I would say, and probably you would find this surprising coming from someone like myself in this audience, but the Middle East has been traumatized in the 20th century and so on by three European imports. One was nationalism, you know, the way that it was imposed. Secularism, the way that Ataturk and Reza Shah has imposed it, and there was no real discourse about role of religion in Islam. In the name of modernity, we pushed away religion. And whereas in the West, secularism was seen in a very different context. If you come in the name of modernity, Arab nationalist elites and so on pushed away religion essentially to the dark corners of mosque, where essentially became incubators for terrorism and so on. I will say also, add to it, even though its impact has been less, communism. The Middle East progress, social and cultural and political progress, have been somewhat traumatized, and we're still paying the price for that. My hope, again, going back to my basic theme, military attacks are important in order to push back the immediate threats. Without that, we would have been in deep trouble. In the same context, what is happening in Syria cannot continue. Kobani, a town near the Turkish border, is now under attack by ISIL. The very moral basis of the international coalition against ISIL is being brought into question. You intervened in Iraq, in Sanjar, yet you're not taking on ISIL as so many civilians are under threat. So I hope the military strikes will be there in order to push back. But remember, this cannot be done just by military strikes. It is about governance, it is about legitimacy, it is also about bringing in the stakeholders into this process. Saudis, Iranians, Turks, the Americans, the Russians. Without that, we will be continuing to deal with this problem for a long, long time to come, sustained by what I termed that political economy. What to do about it is about good governance, is about combating corruption, is about breaking that cycle. This oil that we were talking about is being sold across in Iraq, according to Reuters, to Turkey, in Syria, paying for all of these type of operations. And I very much hope, in terms of the larger battle plan against ISIS and eradicate the scourge, these fundamental issues will be addressed. And also remember always, this is a long-term issue, is not gonna be, mission will not be accomplished anytime soon. It is a generational issue, and it will take a lot of effort to really look at the basics and at the causes, root causes that allows these type of extremism to emerge in our part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. To Nirvana Mahmoud, I'm glad to hear that you think, I can't find you. Sorry, I'm not sure where you are. Hi. I hope that you're right, and I agree with you. We're talking here about transformations that have, moments of hope and then terrible setbacks, and that will take a generation before they produce their results. And I'm very glad that you raised that point. To my friend Ghassan Salameh, who I've learned a lot from over the years, I am trying to be optimistic. So let's take a tour d'horizon. I think Iraq, in many ways, and because of ISIS, has now been given a chance. And in many ways, a year ago, you could not have said that. So sometimes, yes, when you get to the brink of a complete collapse, something good may come out of it. So I think there is a bit of hope in Iraq. I think Tunisia is a country that we should pay more attention to, and that the West should try to help as much as possible, because I think there is an experiment there that has a very good chance of succeeding. It's hard. But I think that there is a culture of compromise that's developing in Tunisia that I don't see elsewhere in the region. And I think even Morocco, to a certain extent, is a transition that started without the same type of political upheaval that we saw elsewhere. It's obviously much slower and it's not as deep. But I think that's another one to watch. I think Dr. Ibtisam raised a very important question of what comes after Daesh. This is the critical issue here, because unless you deal with Daesh through a political, economic, and social, if you don't have a holistic strategy here, then I think in 10 years we'll just end up with another Daesh. It'll just have another name. On the question of Egypt, I'm glad that the military government is helping Bangladesh control the supply of money, and I certainly look forward to the government helping its own people. On Libya, I think the question that today is that we're seeing more and more of an outside intervention in Libya that is that is adding yet another layer of complication to the Syrian crisis. And I think it's very important that all parties in the region work on a common plan of reconciliation rather than feeding the divisions. And finally, on the question of the resilience of Iraq and Syria's neighbors, it seems to me that the Western strategy over the past 2 years has not been about Syria, but about the neighbors. It's been what can we do to actually contain this conflict within Syria and not allow it to spill over. To a certain extent, this has been successful because both Jordan and Lebanon are dealing with a massive influx of refugees. The problem is that in this context, you still have a lot of pressure on these countries, and so they can't work and they can't thrive and they cannot develop when there is so much pressure on them. But I think, in terms of containing the conflict, the strategy has worked pretty well.
Thanks. I can smell the coffee, so I'll be brief to the point of being telegraphic, and I'll answer 3 main points. Let me be frank about Kurdish independence. It's been a roller coaster year for the Kurdish regional government. In December, January, they opened an independent pipeline into Turkey, which gave them an export capacity beyond the control of the Iraqi government. In June 2004, and with the fallout from the siege of Mosul, they expanded their territory by 40%. Almost, you could, in a desperately bad situation, they got nearly all the territory that they'd ever wished for, but at the same time as the Iraqi government had cut their budget. So you have the Peshmerga operating without any wages for 2 weeks out of 4 and controlling a lot of incredibly problematic territory for them. So I think that, and also after President Barzani had announced and now has not pushed forward a referendum towards independence. And I think it's that difficulty, that struggle to control not that 40%, but also simply to defend Erbil against Daesh, which I think brought home the instability and the difficulties of independence more than anything else. And I think you now see a growing collaborative relationship on security going towards politics between Baghdad and Erbil, and possibly a new degree of modesty after 8 years of Nur al-Maliki in Baghdad. So I think that's a positive thing. The second, Professor Ghassan's question on the National Guard. I would say provincial decentralization, not sectarian decentralization. I think that in itself was the issue I was trying to get to. If you push decision-making, service provision, and indeed security down to the provincial level, there's a strong possibility, and this is where I'm optimistic, that it would remove the sectarian dynamic from it. As you, as I know, last time I was in Ramadi, Anbaris were very, very proud of the soldiers, the battalions that were part of the Iraqi army that were recruited locally, and very mistrustful that those soldiers had been stationed outside Anbar. So there is a precedent that exists. I think the crucial point is keeping centralized regulation over locally raised troops. And I think that would come with financial underpinnings. On the final point I'll make is on Sunni Shia terrorism, and this goes to the after Daesh question for Iraq. The belt and, the earthworks that were rapidly thrown up in June, July, August to stop Daesh's march on Baghdad involved the re-militarization of Iraqi security. That everything was thrown at the struggle, and basically the state opened its ranks to a very fluid civilian army. Even before that, the Asib al-Haq, the radical Shia militia, had been used as political commissars within the Iraqi army to bolster and deliver some form of motivation. That leaves an incredible legacy of the militia domination of the streets of Baghdad as we speak. If that isn't rowed back, and that genie put back in its bottle, then we're heading back to an Iraqi civil war, I think. And the final point is on the political economy of the Islamic State or Daesh. On one level, the oil fields are vulnerable. The oil fields that Daesh gets the majority of its money from are vulnerable. They've used that wealth, I must say, in Syria, especially in a putative state building, driving down the price of wheat and bread, delivering service provision along with the horrific violence that they deploy to control the population. Remove the ability to smuggle oil, to pump and smuggle oil from the Islamic State, and you remove their checkbook. And I think that's their military vulnerability. And on that potentially positive note, I'll leave it to Nick. Thanks.
Thank you. I must play bad cop, not only in bringing the session to a close, but also in denying you the coffee that Toby was smelling. As you will see from your agenda, these are back-to-back sessions, so I ask you please all to keep your seats while we have a very rapid turnaround at the top table. I'm therefore asking you not for a standing, but for a sitting ovation for your excellent panel.